All right, welcome back. Let's talk about how anthropologists often get their information. How do they find out about all this stuff that they're learning about culture and all this stuff? So you can be the participant observer. Okay, what is the participant observer? The idea behind this is that you are going to essentially become a member of that society. Okay, you're going to work within that culture. It means that you're going to go out and uh, work with folks in the field. Okay, you're going to work side by side with them. You're going to live with them. You're going to find out what it's like to do the daily chores. You know, what are the daily responsibilities? What are the what is it like to live that life, right? Participant, observer, right? You're going to participate in that community, and you are going to observe what happens, okay? And it's through this participation that we gain insight into any given community. Okay, the idea is that you're going to be spending a lot of your time trying to understand what it's like to live with these folks, right? What is it like? And you're going to meet people and you're going to gain this rapport with them. By working every day side by side, they're no longer going to see you as an outsider. They're going to start to treat you as an insider. And this has got a lot of benefits because sometimes you're going to find that when you're out there talking to folks, that they're going to see you as an outsider and they're not going to give you the kind of information that you might need. And so over time, you have to build this rapport with folks and figure out and build these relationships with people, and then you start finding that they end up giving you a lot more insider information. A lot of the research projects that I've worked on, oftentimes it'll take 5-6 weeks just to get into a decent relationship with somebody before they really sort of start to open up, right? And it's interesting that as an anthropologist, people when they're speaking to an outsider, a lot of times they're a little bit more open with their information, right? They might be a little bit more willing to give you that information. Once you've built that rapport, once you've built that trust within that relationship, people will open up more. And one of the reasons why that is that because you're not necessarily a member of that society, right? You're working within it and you're trying to understand it, but you're not a member of it, right? And they will oftentimes see you as someone safe, right? That if I talk about this subject, it's not going to get me in trouble with anyone else because it's not going to get back to anyone else, right? You're not going to, first of all, your information is that you're getting is going to stay secret, right? You're not going to share it with everyone else out there. But that it also gives them a chance to open up, and feel safe about opening up. So you get this opportunity to gain more insight by being that outsider and by being that person that they feel safe telling this stuff to. So that's really important about becoming that participant observer, about gaining that rapport with folks. And then once you've gained that rapport, a lot of times you will have key informants. And key informants are basically folks that become very influential in your research, right? These are folks that you are going to rely upon when, if you have questions or you need to gain certain types of information, they're the ones that you're going to go to. They become a very large part of your research base, and they also help you oftentimes navigate the community, right? They'll help you avoid the kinds of pitfalls that you might encounter had you not had a guide to take you through this. So having those key informants are super, super important to have. And then we get to like interviews, right? So you're a participant observer. You're gaining knowledge by experience, right? You gain key informants, and they help you avoid those pitfalls. The next thing that we have to do is figure out who or how we're going to sort of gain this kind of information from, right? So we have these two different types of interview styles that we're going to be talking about. In this case, we have structured interviews. Okay, the idea behind structured interviews is that you're going to create a battery of questions, right? You're going to have a big list of questions that you want to have answered. And that's, say, each person that you interview, you give each of those people this same battery of questions, right? It's going to be, A, B, C, and D, right? You want each of them to answer these questions, and then you can compare their answers, right? This is an aspect of quantitative research, right? You've got a whole bunch of questions, and oftentimes they are very in depth, right? But you can start to compare with other people how those questions are being answered. Then we have this informal interview. Instead of structured, we have informal. Informal interviews help us understand sort of the qualitative base. And this is where you have a couple of base questions that you want to have answered, or start with, I should say. And then you kind of let the conversation ramble, right? You get people to open up about their ideas, about their, you let them answer one question, and then that goes into this direction over here, and then it goes over here, and then you're like, well, what about this? I've got, you come up with a new question. You're like, well, what do you think about this? And you oftentimes do these in informal settings as well. So say you're at home preparing a meal, right? And you start off with a couple of questions and basically have a conversation. Well, this is, in a sense, an interview. You're asking questions and getting answers. But it's done in a way that is very much free-flowing, right? And it doesn't necessarily matter how it's structured, just that it's happening. You could be out at the bar, you could be at work, and depending on those given situations, you also might get different answers as well. And that's something else to take into account, that oftentimes the setting is just as important as the questions that you're asking, because it might also determine sort of the focus of those questions or those answers. So if you're at work and you're asking a lot of work-related questions, because they're in that frame of mind, you might get more work-related answers, right? But if you were to ask work-related answers at home, you might get a different response based on the fact that it's a different setting. There's time to contemplate what is happening at work and how that relationship between home and work might be. So that's something else to consider when you're doing an interview. What is the setting? Like, how are you doing this? How are you engaging in this conversation? So it's how you set up your interviews and how you set up your questions very much determines not only on what you're asking, but how you're asking and where you're asking and what time you're asking. Even the time of day can determine how people might answer their questions. And this also even goes in further, and we'll talk a little bit about this later in this lecture, but about your gender, right? Who you are. You know, if you're talking to, if you're a male, say I'm talking to somebody, I'm talking to these folks, I might get different responses based on my maleness, right? If I'm talking to a guy, he might give me certain answers, versus if I'm talking to a woman, I might get different answers, right? Because the relationships between men and women can oftentimes determine what kind of answers I'm giving. Because there are, in culture, there are certain expectations, you know, of how men and women behave, not only between women, but between men and women. So oftentimes we're going to find that depending on any given circumstance, you can get different answers. And that, I think, is one of the most important things to always remember when you're conducting research, is that it is so complicated and can be all over the place, and you have to keep that in mind. That anything that you find out is coming from a certain point of view, right? There's a certain perspective. So, you know, when you're developing these research goals and teams and stuff, it's oftentimes good to incorporate multiple genders and different backgrounds, ages as well. You know, some people might respond to someone that is much older in a different way versus someone that is much younger, right? And there might be different relationships between them. If I'm an old guy walking into and setting up an interview, I might get different responses because people are going to react to age in a little bit different way, right? Versus whether or not I'm young and I'm interacting with someone else that's young, or interacting with someone that's old, right? So all of these things can have an impact on your research. And you always have to keep that in mind when you're doing interviews or whatever type of research that you're doing. One of the things that we do is we also do life histories, right? We sit down with someone and we say, tell me about your life. You know, tell me, what was it like being a kid? What was it like being a young adult or an old person? You know, and then tell me what's changed in your life. You know, what have you experienced? How is your community today versus what it was like, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago? You know, and give me that perspective, right? What is it like? How are things organized? And what do you see that's different, or what do you see that's the same, right? And you might get very different responses from people within that same community. And all of that can be based on the different qualifications, right? You know, are they, what is their gender? What is their age? All of those different things can have an impact on that life history and how they observe their community. So, and this is a great example of also looking at qualitative data, right? You can take all this information and start thinking about how it fits into the identity of that community and that culture. We also do surveys, and surveys are sort of like more of a mini version of a structured interview. Because what you try and do with a survey is get as many responses as you possibly can, and oftentimes, you know, you don't want to get bogged down in a massive list of questions. There are usually targeted things that you want some pretty basic answers to. So you might send out a survey with maybe 10 or 20 questions or something like that, or less, and find out, okay, you know, and get it out to as many people as possible. And then you collect that data back, and you've got a really good set of quantitative data that you can start looking at. And it's usually done so that, you know, pretty simple answers to the questions that you're looking for. But it helps you get, again, a better understanding of the community at large, and can give you some pretty basic ideas about what's happening. We do kinship analysis. Kinship analysis isn't just about family. Oftentimes, when we talk about kinship, it's in relation to family structure, but kinship also extends to other ideas such as like friendships and other relationships, other associations that we might have. For instance, you might find kinship if you ever served in the military. The folks that you work with, you spend so much time and effort with, and you build these bonds, right? So military folks, anyone that's ever served, usually has some sort of connection with other people that they have served, that there's a shared experience. And that can create a bond of friendship and of kinship. And there are other things that, other groups that you can find kinship within if you spend enough time and have enough experience with them and share commonalities. So kinship is kind of a major aspect of what we do as researchers. We're looking for those connections between people. So, and then also how those families are organized. So if we look at, say, family, how do we organize our parents and our grandparents and our cousins and aunts and uncles? Within our society, we have a pretty, strict set of rules as to how our families are organized. We might have, a couple of siblings, right? And then we're going to have our parents, and then we've got aunts and uncles on both sides. And then each of those aunts and uncles have certain responsibilities. And then we have grandparents and great uncles and great aunts, and then more cousins out here. In other cultures, a lot of times we'll see entire generations relating to each other as brother and sister. So, for instance, if I had like first cousins or second cousins, it'd be first cousins, those first cousins would actually be considered family. They'd be not considered family, considered brothers and sisters. So your first cousins from your aunts and uncles, right, would be considered brothers and sisters, and you would treat them as brothers and sisters. And your aunts and uncles might not just be considered aunts and uncles, but they might be considered moms and dads, right? So now you've got whole generational blocks that are treating each other in a very similar pattern, right? So now you've got big, huge families that, this is my brother and this is my sister and this is my sister, even though they might not be of the same parental descent, but they might be, they had that same relationship with you, and you treat them as brother and sister. And that aunt and uncle over there, you treat them as parents, and they treat you as their kids, right? And so it creates these really interesting bonds between family members. There's others that have distinct rules on cousins, and this cousin, this could be your second or third cousin from this aunt or uncle, and each one of them has a different role and responsibility within that family. They're not just cousins, but they're this specialized cousin, and that specialized cousin has a certain role within the family, or an aunt or an uncle, or something like that. Or you might have someone that is of matrilineal descent, and only the women, right, are sort of counted. So, you might have an aunt or uncle, or an aunt and uncle on each side. They might have married in, but the aunt that's been married into the family, that married your uncle, her lineage doesn't count. They don't consider her necessarily a part of the internal fabric of the family. But the aunt that was born in has a much greater role. So the aunt that is a blood relative might have a much deeper understanding. And we'll be going into this a lot with our kinship lecture. But just to give you an idea of some of the things that we look for when we're looking at kinship, and how it relates to people, and how we look at marriage and friendship and all of these things. So yeah, it really is important to understand as we're doing our research. Sort of associated with kinship is this idea of social networks and how we sort of create contacts, or how communities create contacts with each other. And so, and this is really important to understand because a lot of times this helps to understand how marriage patterns are created. A lot of times you have communities that, especially if they're smaller communities, that you will not marry within that immediate community. You have to marry outside of that community. And to do that, you have to have these connections to these other communities that you can find suitable mates, suitable partners. A lot of times you'll have these connections to other communities. One of the really important aspect of this is that, so let's say you marry into this community over here, and depending on whether or not you're matriarchal or patriarchal, depends on maybe who moves in with whose family or who moves to which community. But here's the thing. Let's just say that for some reason you have some sort of problem, right? You go through a famine or there's a disaster or something like that. You know, who do you call on for help, right? And oftentimes it's these other communities that will come in and assist you in fixing whatever problem it is that you're facing. And vice versa, if your other community gets has some sort of problem, you will go out and help them. So creating these social networks and understanding those social networks can help you understand not only the community that you're working within, but also their relationships to outside communities and what their neighbors are also doing. And that gives you a better idea in general of what that larger network is going to look like. Taking field notes. So field notes are really important to the anthropologist. We really strive to try and get as much knowledge as we can and then record it, right? And it covers all kinds of stuff. But we oftentimes have two different field notebooks. We have one that is our particular observations of the community, right? This is sort of like what we might consider like the professional field notebook. You know, what you're observing about this community and what they're doing and how they're doing it and why they're doing it and all of that stuff. And then you have a second notebook. And this is sort of where you do this reflective aspect, right? Where you talk about your experiences. What are you experiencing? How are you feeling about something that's taking place? And this is sort of where why I have all of you doing like reflection homework, right? You know, these reflection papers, is to kind of give you an opportunity to, you know, take in this information that we're talking about in class, and what you're reading and watching, and sort of reflect upon it and try to understand where you stand with this information. And it's really important to do that. It's really important to do that because it helps you understand not only where you stand, what you're experiencing, but also can make you reflect again, like on your own personal bias, right? If you are feeling something about this, whether it's good or bad, or you're angry about something, you can come back and look at that and say, oh, okay, now I've got a better understanding of my thought process, of how I'm dealing with things, and then that can help me take a more unbiased approach in my research. So if you can, you know, talk about those things, your own ideas, your own responses, it'll help you process all of that information as you go along. So these observations, you know, often include things about people, like what they're doing, how they're doing it, what they're wearing, you know, what is their clothing style, their hairstyle, you know, all the things about them as individuals. And then why? What do you think is going on there? Then you have like music. What is the music that they listen to? And how do they make music? Right? Food. What kind of food is available? What is the diversity of food that is available? How healthy is that food? Smells. What does it smell like to be there? What do you pick up? What are you smelling? Do you smell the fire pits? Do you smell the cooking? Do you smell what kind of smells do you have when you walk into a house? And what can those indicators bring to you? If you smell the smell of pets, right? Dogs or cats or whatever, that can give you an idea of their relationship with animals. Weather. What's the weather like there? And how does weather impact that community? Is it rainy? Is it arid? What's going on with the weather, and how does that impact the community on a regular basis? And then once you're doing that, and if you're doing an extensive amount of time, you can start looking at climate and how climate has either changed or stayed the same over any number of years. And that can give you an idea of overall change. And then what's going on, like different events. Are there concerts? Are there like meetings, governmental meetings, communal meetings, religious meetings? All of these different things. And then various places, like where do people go? What are they doing there? Is there a town square, and how often is it used? Who uses it? Is it used for the youth? Is there a place for kids to hang out and play? Or is it more organized than that? So you look at all of these things and try and figure out, okay, so how does all of this stuff sort of fit together? And you write all of this down in your field notes, your observations. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you taste? Right? All of these different things you're going to include in your field notebooks. Another big aspect is mapping, okay? And mapping isn't sort of like the traditional idea of mapping, of like drawing out a map and, this stuff is over here and this stuff is over here and this stuff is over here. In this case, what you're trying to do is you're trying to like describe what these locations are doing and how important those places are. And you can learn a lot about a community based on how they live and where they live and what they do with the space around them. So if you go to a part of town and, the buildings are run down, and there isn't good infrastructure and stuff like that, what can you infer from seeing those things happen, right? What's going on there? How many people are living there? What sort of resources are available in that small area? And we can do this here in like Denver. We can take a look at different communities around Denver and say, okay, who has more supermarkets, right? In my part of town, I can go just about 2 to 3 miles in any direction, and I've got 5 King Soopers. Okay, 5 King Soopers. And that's not even talking about Safeways or Walmarts, or other shopping centers or Whole Foods, right? So I live in a very rich area when it comes to like how much food is available, right? So, but when I was working, say like with the Ute Mountain tribe, they only had the only place where you could buy food on the reservation was either at the truck stop or at the casino, right? There was a restaurant in the casino that you could go to, and then the truck stop had a chicken shack, or you could buy some produce and some stuff in the truck stop, and that was the closest location. Otherwise, you had to drive basically like 12 or 13 miles to get to the nearest supermarket. So that creates an interesting question about access access to food, access to nutrition. How quickly can you access that, right? So all of these different things can give you an idea about how a community is dealing with resources. You know, what do they have access to? What do they not have access to? You do incorporate things like environmental and physical features. Do you live in a desert, right? And what's the access to that? You know, do you have to travel a long ways to get there? And if that's the case, then what kind of resources are available there? Or, you know, do you have to leave to get those resources? Do you live in the mountains? You know, and then what kind of elemental issues might you come across, like snow? And can that prevent travel to and from different places? Access to good water, right? And that's a huge one right there, is what is your access to water? You know, and is it clean? Is it trucked in? Is it piped in? Is it brought in because there's a source of water underneath and you just pump it up through wells? You know, what's the water access? And how clean is it? And those are huge questions. You know, a part of it is like understanding where people live and work and where they also recreate. You know, is there specific locations where there is recreation designated for children, for adults, or for older folks, right? And how do they interact with those areas? You know, do they have access to good recreation? And who's got that access to, or doesn't have access to it, right? Understanding how structures are built, right? That might be something that's really important to understand. Is if you live in a community where you've got older buildings or poorly built buildings, how does that reflect on the community, and what kind of resources do they have for building those kinds of resources? What kind of resources do they actually need? And that's a very interesting question as well. Is, you know, we might look at a community and say, well, you know, this person has a nice house. It's a big house or a small house, or, you know, is it 100 years old? Is it 5 years old? You know, and what are the issues with owning those houses? But we live in a society where, you know, a part of our American dream is to own that house, right? So we strive to own it and then make it our own. And we have this these different ideas about what it's like to own versus what it's like to rent or to live in an apartment. And how much space do you actually have? How much space do you actually need, right, to actually live and succeed in that community? And so understanding how those structures in that community are built in relation to economic questions can give you an idea of how important those structures are. And then also in relation to other resources. You know, is there a rich part of town or a poor part of town? I think one of the really interesting things about mapping, and this is something that just about every anthropologist should do, is that if you're going to map out a community, go to the graveyard. Okay, if there is a graveyard, go to the graveyard and then look at the tombstones, right? If they use tombstones, and find out. You know, you can look at a tombstone and you can see when people died, right? You can gain all kinds of interesting information about how people lived, how long they lived, right? What did they die from? Because sometimes you will find out what they actually died from. Was it the disease, or was it war, right? Oftentimes, if they're veterans or if they lost their life in a conflict, that'll be included. If there was, say, like a disease that broke out, you know, you might see a period of time where there's a lot of gravestones that takes place. And so there could have been some kind of catastrophe that took place. And that might give you an idea about the makeup of the town. Then you can also look at like the condition of those gravestones? Are they in good shape? Which ones are in good shape? Which ones are tended to the most? Are any of them tended to? Right? Will give you an identity of how that community sort of deals with the dead. Right? How do they treat their family members after they've passed away? Are there certain things that they look for or tend to? And what are the familiar responsibilities of tending those who have passed on? So understanding how people die and how they are represented can be really important to understand and can help you sort of understand the community a little bit better. So one of the important things to understand about while you're out there doing this research is that people are people, right? People do all kinds of things for all kinds of different reasons. And this is important to understand as well, is that as we are looking at, say, motivation. So if I have a key informant, okay, and I've been working with this person and they keep feeding me information about things and things start getting a little questionable. And this happens all the time. You'll get information, and sometimes people want to help, right? They want to help, or they also want to help themselves. They will sometimes either make stuff up or sort of embellish certain things to make them a little bit more interesting. And sometimes it's intentionally done, sometimes it's not. Depends on the given circumstance. So your objective is to sort of understand that this is something that happens with people, right? People have different motivations for helping. Sometimes they might gain they're looking for some sort of like prestige from you or from within the community that they're working in. And if they are seen as helping you as a researcher, as this big timer from out of town, right? That maybe that might help them move up in the ranks and prestige. And so it might help them. So if they end up running out of information, maybe they'll make up some stuff. And it happens. So that's why you have to be cautious whenever you're dealing with folks and you're getting information from them. Just keep in mind to be cautious about what's going on and not just rely on like one or two people, but to have a whole bunch of different folks that are helping you to understand. And you're going to find that people are going to be giving you conflicting information, and that's to be expected, right? Because people's experiences aren't always the same, especially when you're talking about different genders and different ages and different idealistic practices and all of these things. They might give you conflicting information. As an anthropologist, you have to be able to take that information and then organize it and say, okay, so this is what I'm hearing from here and this is what I'm hearing from here. It's not that one or the other is true or false. They might very well be true, but it might be true from a different perspective, right? So that's also something that you have to take into account. And again, it seems like it can be very complicated when you're dealing with different cultures, when you're doing research. And it is, but it's also just ridiculously fun. I always have a great time doing that kind of research. It can be, anxiety-filled sometimes, but just the process, the learning is, it's great. It really is great. Even though you have to be careful of everything that's being said or done. Different skills and perspectives. I think one of the cool things about, doing field work is that, you're gaining different perspectives from different people, which helps you gain different perspective about that culture and your own culture. But you might also learn other skills, other ideas. One of the things that I think is always beneficial is if you go into a community. Let's say you go into an agrarian community, like a farming community. Having certain sets of skills going in might help. If you have any experience working as a mechanic or working in agriculture or any of those things might be beneficial to you working with them and learning about that culture and being able to gain those connections. I think one of the skills that we have to develop is understanding our own personal bias. And this takes a lot of practice and a lot of work because it's not always easy to see our own bias where we have a particular position on something that we might feel very, very strongly about. But we have to understand that that might not always be the case given any given circumstance. That we might feel differently or that this community might feel very differently about it. And the point is to understand why. Why does this group feel differently about this thing? And it might be important to you, but they don't see it that way. So if you can sort of figure out the why, but it takes practice to understand bias and where your own personal biases sort of fall into this whole process. Being a skilled listener and being able to not only pick up what's being said, but being able to pick up what's not being said, and the things that are not said or not seen can be just as important about understanding a culture as the things that are seen and are said. Okay, and this could be anything from like, let's take for example a graveyard. Again, we'll go back to this example. Let's say that this community, decorates their graves in very meticulous, exuberant kinds of ways, right? And if they tend to these graves often, right, and have reverence for those that have passed on, the idea behind that, it might give you a different perspective about their relationship with the past or their relationship with spirituality. Are these people completely dead, or is there a spiritual aspect where they might be spirits and still living, or do they need to be appeased, right? Could there be a fear of the dead? And unless you tend to them regularly, they might become angry and cause ill to the community involved. Or what if they don't have any graves, right? How do they deal with their dead? Do they cremate them? How do they respect the body once the soul has left, right? Do they believe in a soul? And if you die, if that soul leaves, is the body an empty husk? And therefore, it means nothing, right? Different cultures can treat these different things differently. And so being able to look at how they treat their dead, whether or not there is like a gravestone or there isn't, can give you an idea about their relationship with like spirituality. So what's there and what isn't there can be just as important to your research. The other thing is sometimes there are subjects that are too difficult to discuss or shouldn't be discussed, these taboo items. And sometimes you might not have earned the trust yet to be able to discuss those things. We talked about different circumstances within a community where you might be able to have that conversation, where you're doing your informal interviews and you're at the workplace, right? And you're doing this interview and you ask a particular question that might be considered taboo, and that person might not answer it, or might not answer it truthfully, or might give an expected response by everyone in the community in an open setting. But when you get back to the home or you get back to a more private setting, you might get a different answer, based on whether or not you are trusted, whether or not you're in the appropriate space to discuss those things. So understanding how sort of taboo subjects and finding out what those subjects are can help you figure out a way to access those answers, right? Um, let's see here. And then there's also this process which Americans sometimes find difficult to do, and that's to just sit and watch, right? It's just to sit and watch and observe what is happening, and take your time to just kind of notice the goings on of a community. Just sit in one space and just observe, right? Who's doing what where? How many people are walking through this community space? What are they doing? How are they using their time, right? And you just observe, right? What is going on in that community? And we have this tendency as Americans to kind of like go go go. If I'm not busy, I'm not working, right? If I'm not working, I'm not being productive. And anthropology will sometimes take that and say, well, sometimes if we are going to try and understand something, we don't need to ask it questions. We don't have to get engaged with it. We don't have to be full on into it, just going like, well, what about this and what about that? Sometimes we have to sort of sit and observe, and we might sit and observe for a while, right? And just see how things happen. And that can be really, really important as we are trying to learn about this community. Mutual transformation. Okay, this is something that we sort of had to come to grips with as anthropologists. For the most part, we've always kind of wanted to not have an impact on the community. We're supposed to be sort of like the fly on the wall, right? We're observers, we are recording our information, and we're doing research, but that it doesn't work that way. Anytime that you have contact with people, anytime that you have any sort of interaction, they are learning just as much from you as you are from them. Okay? And you're going to have an impact. Sometimes you're going to have just a personal impact. Sometimes you're going to have a financial impact. Oftentimes when we're working with key informants, they will oftentimes get compensated, because they're working for you. They're doing something for you, and so then we do something for them, and that might oftentimes look like we might be giving them money, and that is another thing that we have to understand that we talked about with those issues. So we have to understand that we have that impact, and that they are going to have an impact on you, that they are going to ingrain their identity onto who you are, and that there are things that you are going to learn and appreciate and like or dislike based on your experiences within that community. And it can be difficult to deal with, right? It can be tough to sort of comprehend those issues. And it's important to try and understand how that's going to take place. It's something to consider as you're planning your research. How might this take place? How do I expect maybe I'll be changed? And then expect the unexpected, right? You might not know how it's going to change you. I think a really important thing to understand about anthropology as well, and this is a hard-learned lesson, is that we sort of take a similar oath of conduct as you might with like the Hippocratic oath that medical doctors take, to do no harm. So this is something that we also sort of expect when we're doing our research, that we are going to have an impact in this community. How do we make sure that we mitigate or minimize any negative impacts. And it can happen. There are incidences in my own past where things didn't quite go the way that we expected it to, and there were issues that came up. And then how do you deal with those issues? So it's important to kind of take those things into consideration when you're planning research, and then also to maintain sort of those generalized practices of trying to minimize damage. And in most cases, if you're a good anthropologist, you will, right? Because you have an understanding of that culture, or you're learning about that culture. And oftentimes, because you're an outsider, a lot of times there's a little bit more leeway, right? They know that you're not expected to know their rules right off the bat. So if you do make that faux pas, if you do make that, that breach in etiquette, that they will help you along because you are there to learn, and they know that, right? That is accepted by both you and them. Throughout the process of doing research, we also do analysis, right? And it's not that we do analysis just at the end, right? After we've collected all of our data and we go home and then we do an analysis. No. It doesn't work like that. We are constantly going back to our field notes, both our sort of our professional in the field notebook and our personal notebook, right? And we're going over that stuff. Or if we're recording video or photography or audio, we're going over that and we're reassessing, right? We're changing our ideas. We're challenging our ideas about what's happening in this community. So it's very important to continually do analysis on it. And then there's also a couple of different types of analysis that we do. We have an emic approach and an etic approach. The emic approach is that personal approach, the approach of working within the community, working with individuals, being a member of that community. That's sort of the personalized research analysis. Then we have the etic approach, and the etic approach is sort of like we stand back, right? We stand back and we look at our observations in general, right? What broader ideas can we put to this community, right? What are some of the more maybe quantitative ideas can we analyze within this community? And it also gives us a chance to sort of look at other communities as well. So we can stand back and say, take a broader look at how their interactions with themselves and with other communities are. And then once we've sort of put all of this information together, we've done all the interviews and we've done all this stuff, then we come to the point where it's like we can create this ethnography, right? And the ethnography is the story of that culture. And I think it's also important to understand that when we're doing an ethnography, that we also understand that it'll never be a complete ethnography because cultures are so dynamic and they're so complex and they're large and they also change over time, right? So we might do an ethnography at this point in time with these people as our key informants and our interviewees, and and it gives us a snapshot of this culture right here and now. And in 20 years, that culture might have changed, right? It might be different, and then we can go back and say, okay, so what's changed in this community, and how do we address it? How do we look at it? So ethnographies, I oftentimes look at as sort of like creating that basic understanding of that culture at that time, a snapshot in time of that community, a very detailed snapshot, right? Ethnographies are usually very, very dynamic and have a lot of information in them, but it is just sort of a slice of pie from this much larger entity of culture. How do anthropologists write an ethnography? Okay. And it's changed drastically over the years. It used to be that um, writing an ethnography was about putting the anthropological voice to the subject matter. So I would say, okay, I'm the author, I'm the researcher, and this is all of my experience, and this is what I learned, and this is the identity of this culture, using this, sort of Western cultural idealism of what it means to organize and structure what this culture is going to look like. And that's how it's been done for decades and decades and decades, right? And it's not necessarily complete, and that's one of the things that I want to mention, if we consider the movie for this week, Dead Birds. One of the issues and I really like this movie because it gives a great sort of look into this community, but whose voice do you actually hear, right? You don't hear the voice of the people in there. You hear the voice of the anthropologist, right? And it's just his voice. It's his voice that's explaining or extrapolating the events that are being seen. And this is a very traditional way that anthropology was used to go about culture and to understand that culture. And that's kind of changing, and it's been changing for a number of years, about how we approach research. One of the important things that we try to do now is include this concept of polyvocality. Poly being multiple, and vocality being voice, so multiple voices. Right? So when we're doing our research, it's not just like not including a whole bunch of people that we interview and stuff like that, but we actually use their own words, right? And this has become much easier with the advent of modern technology, with video cameras and audio equipment. You can actually capture their voices, capture their expressions, and then use those as a means to demonstrate their autonomy, right? Their agency within that community. And so it's no longer just the voice of the anthropologist. The anthropologist still has a very important role as being sort of the interpreter, right? The person that says, okay, so these folks are doing and experiencing this, and this is how it differs from us. And this is how it's the same as us, and sort of helping both sides to sort of understand each other. And I think that's the really important thing about contemporary research is including multiple voices, right? And you'll see this oftentimes in a lot of documentaries. Right? If we look at Dead Birds and other anthropological research done decades ago, we'll oftentimes just hear the anthropological voice. Whereas modern day practices, oftentimes we hear those voices. We hear those people, what they're saying and what they're doing. And they might be subtitled or they might be translated, but at least we're hearing it. At least we're getting to experience a little bit of that culture in that medium. So, and then also there's this idea of how people should recognize their own identity. And that, as a researcher, old anthropologists, as soon as they were done with their research, without the consent of the people that they were researching with, or that they were living with and researching on, they would take their research back and write their paper or publish their book or do their documentary without necessarily the approval of the people they were working with. Whether or not that those people agreed with the depiction that was being made of them. And that's a really important thing to think about when you're dealing with culture, right? When you're dealing with people is, are they being represented fairly? And so a lot of modern day cultural anthropologists and anthropologists in general will incorporate the people that they're working with and say, okay, this is what I'm finding, and that's include your own words and thoughts in this, right? And then they have a voice in how they are depicted, to the reader or to the viewer. And that's really important. Again, giving the folks that you are working with agency, right? And being able to self-identify. With this, of course, there are issues. And so the question for this exercise is, what are the benefits and possible complications by letting people tell their own stories, right? And the benefits, of course, are that they are given agency, right? They are given opportunity to share their voice and to share their own experiences and all of that. At the same time, sometimes people might not want to have a certain aspect of their culture described, or maybe there's something that they don't like or they don't want to talk about, and if it gets put in there or whatever, they might downplay it. There might be a negative thing that they don't acknowledge, right? So come up with some ideas about what might be some of the benefits or possible complications of letting people tell their own stories, because it's not necessarily, we're not necessarily looking for fault. We are just expecting people to sort of behave like people, and people have different ideas about their own cultures and what they think is right or wrong, or what might best represent themselves, right? Oftentimes, we put our best foot forward when we're trying to describe ourselves. Like if you've ever been on like a dating website, right? Well, you don't put all of your negative things on there, right? You don't put on there that, yeah, I probably eat too many Cheetos. I hate Cheetos, but I'm just giving you an example. Or I have like some really weird collections. Or I snore, right? Nobody puts that they snore on a dating website. That's never happened. But it happens. It's a real life thing, right? But we don't broadcast it. So those are some of the things that we have to accept when we're doing this research, that oftentimes people will put their best foot forward when they are trying to describe themselves. Something to always take into consideration as you're doing your research. Then we have this concept of reflexivity. Okay, and reflexivity is this process in which we try and really dive into our own research and our own experience. Okay, understanding our bias, helping sort of like we include reflexivity in our research so that the readers and other researchers can know our state of mind, can understand what we were thinking. So that includes when you're doing your ethnography, that you're recounting all of the research that you've done. You also include your own personal experiences. Those two different field books that we were talking about, both of those field books get put into the ethnography, right? They both get put in so that the folks that are observing this can understand the context, right? The context of the research, of what they are reading, and that this personal experience that took place, where it sort of fits in, and you can sort of judge the validity of that research that's been done, and that's really important to understand. Also recognizing the fact that there are limitations to your research. If I go into a certain community as a white man, I might get a different response if I were going into a community as a black woman, right? Because I'm going to have a different response given on any different community, right? And how they deal with sex or gender or race or any of those different things, whether or not I speak the language, right? Just being able to speak the language or a different type of even dialect can have an impact on the research that you're going to have. So being able to understand those contexts, where you're coming from, who you are, has an impact on your research, right? It's just as important as the research that's being done is recognizing who it's coming from, right? And so when you're planning a research project, you know, creating a diverse team is going to be very, very beneficial to your research because you're going to get different perspectives and different information from those people. And they will open up in different ways. Always something to kind of take into consideration. Then we have something like ethnographic authority. So, you know, what gives us the right to sort of talk about this stuff? You know, what gives us the right to go into a community and then write about it? And this has been kind of a moral and ethical question that us as anthropologists have dealt with for years. Dealing like, you know, what gives us the right to do this? You know, to sort of give character to a community. And a lot of it comes down to, you know, sort of like, you know, we have this experience, we have this desire for knowledge, and it's our approach. It's the fact that we do go to school for years, and we go out and we have these experiences, and we want to learn about other folks, and we do it in a way that isn't damaging, right? Again, sort of that code of ethics that we have where, you know, we try and do no harm. And in this process, how we go about it, having the polyvocality, you know, including as many voices as we can to get the best representation of that community, allows us to, you know, sort of give a little bit more authenticity to our research. And then we also do a lot of peer review. We do a ton of peer review. We look at other folks who have done this kind of research, who have had similar experiences, and they will challenge what it is that we have done, you know, and look at it and dissect it and try and discern some, you know, the identity of what we have done and created. Because that is essentially what we're doing, is we're creating a narrative of this culture, this identity, this story of this community. And how we do it is just important as to why we do it or to the results of that research. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff that goes into sort of the ethical and moral responsibilities that we have as researchers, as we're dealing with people, and people have agency and the right to their own humanity, that we have to respect that right, that agency, and them as individuals and as a community. So what moral and ethical concerns do we have? So, you know, again, the idea of like do no harm. The American Anthropological Association has set up sort of like a set of guidelines to follow. You know, whenever you go into a community, these are certain things that you should do that are morally and ethically right. You know, and they help us sort of navigate a very, very complicated field. Anytime you're dealing with people, things become complicated. How do you deal with people? How do you deal with kids? And how do you deal with them in your research? And that's a tough question because dealing with kids can be a very, very ethical and morally gray zone. So a lot of times kids are not always necessarily included. One of the really important things that we do is obtain informed consent. Okay, if you're going to interview someone, if you're going to talk to them, they have to know what's going on, right? They have to know what your intention is, right? If you're going to interview someone, say, yeah, I want to do this interview. I want to talk to you about all of this stuff, and I'm going to, use this as a part of my research. And are you willing to be a part of my research? And if they say yes, then great. If they say no, then no, right? So that's a really important thing to always understand. We also, a lot of times, give anonymity to the people that we work with. We will give pseudonyms to folks that, maybe there might be some retaliation. If they say something that other people don't like, could it harm them in some way? And so we have to take those sort of things into account. Or, could that research be used later on to cause damage to folks? And we've had this experience in the past where some of the historical aspects of anthropology, there was a time, I think in the late 60s, early 70s, where anthropological data that had been collected by anthropologists in Central and South America was then conscripted to be used by the CIA. And the CIA went in and made decisions and killed people based off of information that anthropologists had provided. And that creates a very, very difficult and ethical question, which has led anthropology to very much steer clear of being involved in the military, because they don't want to use their resources and culture and understanding people and getting to know people and, figuring out how they work so that, later on someone can come bomb them, right? There's some serious ethical and moral issues dealing with that. So anthropology and the military have had some very, very complicated relationships in the last number of decades. So it helps when we do our research that we don't always use the folks' names that we're actually working with. So, as sort of a conclusion to this lecture, which I'm sure all of us are celebrating that there's a conclusion, woohoo, that the art of field work is important to the cultural anthropologist. It is where and how we find out about culture. Field work is a large part of what we do, right? Going out there, understanding a community, whatever that community is, whether it's here at home or it's abroad, right? Field work is really important to get out there and experience what's happening. There's lots of different ways to conduct field work, quantitative and qualitative research, emic and etic views and ways to engage and to analyze participant observation, getting in there and experiencing what it's like to live that life. Doing life histories and kinship analysis, understanding what it is to be a member of that community, and especially over time and how their social networks are connected. Mapping and understanding where people live and how it's organized and what the economic relationship status is and power relationship, recreation, and all of these different things are very important to understand about that community. What do they have access to and what do they not have access to? Understanding polyvocality, using multiple voices in your research, making sure that people are aware and informed and have a chance to voice their own identity is extremely important. And then also sort of the morals and values, the do no harm, while you're learning about all of this stuff that's going on. It's imperative that you take those things into consideration as you're doing your research. Okay, that's it. For homework, same thing. Reflection paper. We'll have a discussion about the stuff that we've discussed in these lectures. The homework, the reflection paper, 1 page, same as last week. Write about what you thought about doing field work. Was there something that you learned? Was there something that you found interesting? Was there something that you have questions about? Write it up, 1 page, at least 250 words. Let's see, what else? I think that's it. If you have any question, any concern, any extra questions that you want to have answered, please feel free to hit me up. Let me know. There's a lot of this stuff. I've done a lot of field work. I have literally lived in tents. If I were to count all of the months that I've spent living in tents all the time, probably lived in a tent for like at least 2 years out of my life, of being in the field, working within different communities, living in different situations, traveling around the world. It's a blast. I absolutely love it. I think field work is the best part of anthropology, is to get out there and actually do it. So, yeah. Okay. We will talk to you later, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. We'll see you soon.